Welcome to Where Her Heart Speaks, a show designed to challenge and disrupt ineffective thoughts and behaviors to help you not only embody peace, joy, calm, and certainty, but also to help you live the life you've always dreamed of living. Where Her Heart Speaks with Coach Catherine begins now.
Hi there, it's Coach Catherine. Women leaders have long been oppressed by patriarchal systems. Despite finding ways to navigate, rise above, and occupy spaces that were previously held by white men, there remains a blatant disregard of women leaders' qualities, talents, and abilities in far too many organizations. If you're a woman leader or a woman who desires to climb the corporate ladder, and you do not yet know the term collaborative confidence, you are doing yourself a disservice. Collaborative Confidence is the title of Dr. Heather Backstrom's newly released #1 bestseller, wherein she provides the framework, facts, implementable strategies, and more about how women leaders can activate self-awareness, amplify their authentic talents, and accelerate workplace change. Collaborative Confidence by Dr. Heather Backstrom can be purchased from Amazon.com, BarnesandNobles.com, or Dr. Backstrom's website at www.heatherbackstrom, HeatherBackstrom.com. Listen, if you're ready to activate, amplify, and accelerate in your career, be sure to purchase your copy today. Welcome and welcome back. I'm Catherine James, international speaker, best-selling author, trauma-informed coach, and the host of this radio show and podcast, Where Her Heart Speaks. July is Minority Mental Health Month. And in recognition of same, I've decided to bring you a series called All About Trauma. Now, you may be wondering why trauma, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I want to say that during each episode over the next 4 months or the remainder of July, we're going to discuss an aspect of trauma. And I also, before I get too far, I want to say or apologize about my voice. I've been sick, and if you missed me last week, that was why we had to do a rerun. But over the next 4 weeks, we are going to discuss an aspect of trauma. And the reason why trauma, I often talk about trauma, not simply as a trauma-informed coach, but because trauma and the effects of trauma is something that I am very passionate about. And I often wonder if people sit out and question to themselves, like, why is she always talking about trauma? And it's simply because, like I said, I'm very passionate about it, but when I came to understand trauma, how I was responding to trauma that had taken place earlier in my life, how it was impacting my adult life, when I came to understand those things, it not only helped me to heal wounds that I didn't know I had, but it also freed me. It freed me to truly live life on what I like to say my own terms. It freed me to be my authentic self, the self that God created versus the self that trauma had changed. So before I understood the effects of trauma and how it was impacting me, I was showing up as a person that trauma had actually changed because I was living in my trauma response. So next week, I'm going to share with you what I now call my 2 a.m. experience. My whole life changed after this 2 a.m. experience. Excuse me. And I knew that I had to learn everything I could about the effects of trauma. And not only that I had to learn them, but that I also had to share this information with others. So before we get into that, or before we dive into too far other areas, I want to start this week at the beginning. I'm going to say at the beginning this week. Next week, we're going to talk about the nervous system. But I think before we can even talk about the nervous system, we want to understand the basics. So, this episode, we are returning to the basics. And before I go any further, I want to warn you that the content may be triggering. It may bring about uncomfortable feelings. And as always, if you've listened to me in the past, I am an advocate for you taking care of yourself first. So if you find that you're experiencing feelings of discomfort, be sure that you take care of yourself. Taking care of yourself is more important than anything I will share on this radio show or on this podcast. One way to bringing yourself present, oftentimes when we start to have these uncomfortable feelings, it's because we've allowed ourselves to drift back to the past, and we start ruminating or thinking about things that have happened in the past. So I often will say, bring yourself present. You're bringing yourself present because that's where you want to be. And so in order to do that, bring yourself present and ground yourself. You want to change your state. Change your state and move your body. So if you find that you are feeling uncomfortable, starting to think about something that's happened in the past, I want to urge you to stand up and take a walk. Walk to another room. And as you are walking, notice what's happening inside of your body as you're walking. Notice the pressure on your feet at the bottom of your foot with each step. Notice your breath. Are you breathing fast? Are you breathing slow? Are you breathing deeply? Or are your breaths short and shallow? Just notice. Notice what's happening inside of your body. And I'm going to say, continue listening if and only if your discomfort has resolved by the time you return to the room that you were in. Okay? So please, please take care of yourself. Excuse me. If you've had the radio or TV on for any amount of time, you've heard the word. If you've read magazine covers while maybe standing in line at the grocery store, listened to a sermon at church, you've heard the word. And if you've done any scrolling on social media, sat in the break room at work, or listened to a dramatic relative, you've heard the word. What one word is so popular? What one word is so popular that it spans such a wide and diverse demographic? What one word seems to be everywhere you turn? A word that not long ago was rarely known and certainly not talked about in mainstream or on Main Street. What word am I talking about? The word is trauma. On one hand, I want to say that it's great that it's being talked about. I'd say by nearly everyone and nearly everywhere. I mean, everyone, from those without homes to those living in the White House. Like, it's being talked about, and that's a good thing. We can only hope that the greater attention that's being placed, the greater the attention that's being placed, will bring about a greater understanding and eventually a greater healing. And if I were being honest, I would say ultimately wellness in the world, healing and wellness worldwide, because trauma is pervasive, it is everywhere. So on the other hand, though, the fact that it is being used so casually and out of context is concerning. Because I'd say, for one, we don't want to, and neither should we, minimize people's experiences. We don't want to be so cavalier that we're just throwing this word around, and people who have actually experienced trauma no longer is an anomaly, if you will. And then I'm going to say, two, we don't want to overlook the severity of traumatic experiences or lose the weight of the word by watering it down. When we hear the word trauma, it raises our attention. I mean, it's like everyone almost is like, oh my gosh, what happened? Like, it grabs you. But the more we throw it out there and use it in this very cavalier manner, it becomes more and more watered down. Excuse me. So that being said, this episode is the first in a series I'm calling All About Trauma. And again, today we're covering the basics. What is trauma? What trauma is not? We're going to talk about the types of trauma and some myths that are often heard when it comes to trauma. Before we can look at what trauma is, I want to say let's get really clear on what trauma is not. And a quick disclaimer here, since I don't believe that anyone can state what's traumatic for another person. I do not personally believe that. And while I give examples which hold true for the majority, it may not be true for all. And this will become more clear as we dive into the definition of what trauma is. But I just want to say that I don't believe that anyone can state when someone has experienced a traumatic event and how that event has affected them to determine whether or not it was traumatic for them. Okay, so I'm careful in that. So these examples that I'm sharing are examples that I'm saying are not traumatic events. Okay. I was talking with someone not long ago, and she was in the store waiting to be acknowledged by the store owner. And as she stood there waiting, another patron walked up, and the store owner not only acknowledged that person, but began to serve that person. And so the woman that I was speaking with spoke up and stated she had been waiting for a while and she should actually be served first. The owner acted as though he didn't hear her. And so before it was all said and done, the two of them entered a shouting match, and it got a little heated and confrontational, and she angrily left the store. Now, as she's retelling me the story, she stated, I could not believe he treated me that way. I was traumatized. And I will say, this is not trauma. Perhaps it made her uncomfortable and obviously angry, but likely it wasn't a traumatic event. Another example, imagine being at work, sitting at your desk, and a subordinate abruptly enters your office, voice raised and telling you, you did not do your job. Now, you're taken back at the behavior and you know that it's inappropriate, and you attempt to calm her down to no avail. And at some point, you look up and you notice a crowd of spectators has gathered outside of your door. And after what feels like an eternity and a failed attempt to diffuse the situation, the person storms out of your office just as abruptly as she entered. You are livid, you're shaking, you're embarrassed, and just steaming. And as you discuss the details with human resources, you advise them that the experience was traumatic. Trauma or not? Again, I will say not. Why? Because not all stressful situations or events equate to trauma. Not all stressful situations or events equate to trauma. And unfortunately, what's being seen is just that. People are claiming that stressful events are traumatic for them. Stressful events are being deemed as traumatic events. I want to say that trauma carries a very specific definition. And because of its definition, it sets it aside from normal, everyday stress that we experience in life. It puts it in its own category. And according to the American Psychological Association, trauma is any disturbing experience that results in significant fear, helplessness, dissociation, confusion, or other disruptive feelings that are intense enough to have a long-lasting negative effect on a person's attitudes, behaviors, and other aspects of their functioning. This definition goes on to say that traumatic events includes those caused by human behavior, such as rape, war, industrial accidents, as well as those caused by nature, such as earthquakes. And they often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. That is so important. Vital part of the definition. They often challenge an individual's view of the world as a just, safe, and predictable place. Another definition is by Dr. Let's see. It'll come to me. But it says an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. An event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, he is the author of The Body Keeps Score. And then one of my favorite is by Dr. Gabor Mate. Dr. Gabor Mate says, trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. Trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. He goes on to say trauma is that scarring that makes you less flexible, more rigid, less feeling, and more defended. That's trauma. And that's why earlier I said, although I'm saying that these examples are not trauma, I had to put that disclaimer out there saying that they're not traumatic events for most, but I could not say that they would not be traumatic events for all. Because again, no one can determine when one's nervous system experiences something so extreme that it becomes overwhelmed, or whether an experience causes an inner shifting. No one can determine that. Sometimes not even the person who is in the experience, the person who is sustaining the trauma. So what we must remember, and again, what I love is the way Dr. Gabor Mate says it. He says trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. And this is also why I cringe every time I hear people describe traumas as big T traumas and little t traumas. Now, I understand it's an effort to delineate between the types of events, and I am guilty. I sometimes, too, use the terms myself for the same purpose, trying to bring about clarity. But it's not the event. It's the physiological response. And when we call events big and small, attention is given to the event as opposed to the response. So the event itself, it may or may not be traumatic. It may or may not be traumatic. Like, it doesn't matter if the event is big or small. If something happens inside of a person, it is traumatic for that person. If nothing happens, it wasn't traumatic. So that is the definition of trauma. Did something happen inside of you, inside of a person, that changed how they saw the world in terms of it being safe, in terms of it being reliable? Next, we're going to look at types of trauma. And there are many, many types of trauma. We have generational trauma, there's organizational trauma, there's childhood trauma, systemic trauma. Like, I could go on and on and on and on. There are so many types of trauma. But for the sake of this episode, I want to look at three main categories. And I'm going to call them categories of trauma, as opposed to just types of trauma. They are named as types of trauma, but I'm calling them categories because I think that every type of trauma can fall within these categories: acute, chronic, and complex. Again, of the varied types of trauma, they will all fit into one or more of these three categories. Now, most are familiar with acute trauma. Acute trauma occurs as a result of a single and sudden event, such as maybe a major car accident, an assault, or a natural disaster. That's an acute trauma. And oftentimes when people hear the word trauma, that's what we think about. But there's also something called chronic trauma. And chronic trauma occurs as a result of repeated and ongoing events, such as domestic violence. such as child neglect or child abuse or war. Those fall under the category of chronic trauma, something that is ongoing and repeated. And the other category, complex trauma. Complex trauma occurs as a result of multiple traumatic events occurring either at the same time or one after the other, such as homelessness, loss of a parent, and systemic racism. Like those three things could be occurring at the same time, or they can be experienced one after another. They can be occurring concurrently, or they can be occurring successively in a very short period of time. So just as with the big and small T events, the type of trauma may or may not prove to be traumatic for an individual. One person's nervous system may experience intense sensations and respond in a manner that will keep you safe in the future. And that's typically what a trauma response is. It's when the nervous system shifts. You heard me say I was back to the person God created versus the person trauma had changed. The nervous system changes how we show up in the world so that it can keep you safe in the future or keep you from avoiding whatever that painful experience was. So one person's nervous system can respond in that manner, while another person's nervous system may not be affected at all. Why is that? And we'll talk about that in a moment. So lastly, I just want to quickly get into some myths around trauma. And I'm also going to say, I realize that I'm moving through this kind of quickly. I have been careful to dissect it as much as possible in the moment. And I'm moving through kind of quickly. So if you have any questions or there's anything that you don't understand, feel free to reach out. You can leave a comment. I'll go in, be sure to answer, or you can reach out to me at coachcatherine@gmail.com. Okay, so lastly, I want to talk about some myths around trauma. And again, there's many, but for the sake of time, I'm going to only look at 3 for the sake of time and for the sake of my voice. I'm going to only look at 3. So the first one is traumatic events affect everyone the same. So that's a myth. Traumatic events affect everyone the same. And I spoke to this a little bit earlier. Not everyone responds in the same manner, even though they may experience the same event at the same time. Not everyone responds in the same manner. Why is that? Some reasons include the type of event and whether or not a person could do something in the moment, such as maybe help facilitate an escape, help save others, or somehow allow their bodies to complete the processing that's necessary in the moment of the event or at the moment of the event. If your body's able to finish processing the energy that was stirred up as a result of that event, then you may not be impacted in the same way that a person who was not able to complete that process. Another reason is simply your makeup. Some people are more resourceful and resilient than others. And this is likely based upon their earlier lives, depending on what happened. But some people are more resourceful and more resilient. And then our spiritual and philosophical belief systems is another reason. If you are a person who believes that all things happen for you, even though you go through this traumatic event alongside someone else and they believe that the sky is always falling, you will likely have two different responses. Other reasons are your attachment style. Do you have a secure attachment style? Do you have a disorganized attachment style? And familiarity. Is it something that you have experienced before? So these again are just a couple or a few reasons why people may respond differently. That's myth number one. Myth number two, only major events can be traumatic. And again, this goes back to the big T and the little t. The big T and the little t. All events can be traumatic. All events can maybe not be traumatic. It really is not about the event, but it's about how the person responds to the event. We go back to the definition. It's not about the event, but about how the body responds to the event. And again, this can be both what we call, I'm going to say air quotes, major events such as war, rape, an assault, or minor events. And minor events would be something such as verbal abuse, those things that take place that maybe nobody knows is going on. So minor events is included in that. I said verbal abuse, also hunger or maybe feeling unloved. Okay. So the third myth is healing from trauma isn't possible. And I'm just going to say, can we say thank God for neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity is the nervous system's and the brain's ability to change and adapt. Like the neural networks actually reorganize and change based on and in response to our experiences. So it was once believed that if the brain was a certain way or the nervous system was a certain way, it would always be that way. We now know because of research and modern science, and I don't even know if it's so modern I guess it's modern in comparison to, or it's relative is what I'll say, based on how long the research has been around. But what we know is that the brain and the nervous system does have an ability to change. It does have an ability to adapt based on its environment, based on the information that goes in, based on its experiences. So there is empirical evidence that the brain and the nervous system can actually change, which means that healing from traumatic experiences is possible. So we've covered what trauma is, what trauma is not. We've gotten very clear on the fact that trauma is not about the event, but about what happens in the body as a result of the event. We've looked at traumatic category or trauma categories and trauma myths. So next week, we're going to look at the nervous system, its role in trauma, why it's more responsible for keeping us stuck than the brain is, what happens in the body when trauma is experienced, and more. but all about the nervous system. And as I move to close this week, my prayer for you this week is that you will come to understand the basics of trauma, that you will use the word appropriately, and that you will reach out for help if you believe you may have experienced and continue to be impacted by trauma. In reaching out, you can reach out either to myself, a minister, a therapist, a counselor. If it's me, you can connect with me by going to www.calendly.com/Coach Catherine. If it's not, do yourself the honor of reaching out to someone for yourself. Reaching out to someone for yourself. And again, I am a trauma-informed coach. I am not licensed, so if you reach out to me and I determine that I am not the person that's best suited to support you, I will get you to someone who is more suited or better suited to support you and serve you. So as I bring this to an end, I'm simply going to remind you that in this life we get to choose. Choose to listen from where your heart speaks and choose to live a sensational life. Peace and blessings.
Thank you for listening to Where Her Heart Speaks with Coach Catherine, where Catherine aims to challenge and disrupt ineffective thoughts and behaviors to help you not only embody peace, joy, calm, and certainty, but also help you live the life you've always dreamed of living. Follow Catherine on Facebook and Instagram at I Am Catherine James and visit www.catherinejames.com. Remember, to live the life of your dreams, you must go within and return to the place where your heart speaks.